This is Spion Kop, a hill in Natal, South Africa. On the 23rd of January, 1900, it looked like this. The top of the hill was crisscrossed with entrenchments and littered with British dead. In the early stages of the Boer War, the empire of Great Britain was humbled by a motley collection of farmers and burghers armed with little more than rifles. How could the Boers do such a thing to the British Empire? I'll answer that question and a good deal more. I am Major Arthur Alphen, and this is the history of small arms technology. Our discussion of small arms technology starts with the flintlock smoothbore musket. This weapon was in general issue by the early 1700s, completely supplanting the old matchlock with its fork rest and protecting formation of pikemen. A hammer was mounted on the side of the flintlock, powered by a spring and released by a trigger. This hammer had a set of screw jaws which held a piece of flint rigidly in place. At a point under the hammer's arc of travel, a touch hole was drilled to the interior of the barrel. Mounted underneath this touch hole was a pan which held priming powder. On the forward edge of this pan, another part, the frizzen, was mounted on a hinge. When the weapon was cocked, the frizzen covered the pan, keeping the priming powder in place. When the hammer was released, the flint struck the upper wing of the frizzen, causing sparks and knocking the frizzen forward. These sparks then fell into the pan, igniting the priming powder and the main propelling charge. The flintlock smoothbore was loaded from a paper cartridge. This is not a cartridge as you understand it today, but simply a paper envelope containing a pre-measured amount of black powder and a leaden ball. The soldier tore the cartridge in half by biting on the ball and wrenching the remainder of the paper away. He then poured a small amount of powder into the priming pan, closed the frizzen, and dropped the butt on the ground. The remainder of the powder was poured down the barrel and the paper discarded. Taking the leaden ball from his teeth, he dropped it down the barrel, discarding any paper which remained. You should note that though the bore of this Brown Bess is 75 caliber, it fires a 69 caliber ball. All flintlock smoothbores used balls of similar undersized dimensions. Black powder, a mixture of charcoal, saltpeter, and sulfur, left behind large quantities of fouling in the barrel. If the weapon was to be loaded after 4 or 5 shots, this gap between the ball and barrel had to exist, or the weapon could not be loaded. After dropping the ball into the barrel, the soldier withdrew the ramrod, rammed the ball home, and replaced the ramrod underneath the barrel. He then placed the weapon to his shoulder and pulled the trigger. You should also understand that the soldier did not aim. The sloppy fit between barrel and ball made the weapon hopelessly inaccurate. The target represented a formation of men and reveals the inaccuracy of the weapon. The 5 hits from 7 shots total are circled in red. On our chart, the Brown Bess looks quite good. It has roughly the same range as the matchlock, yet its volume of fire is triple. Many methods of combining the pike with a firearm were tried. By 1700, this had evolved into the socket bayonet, which locked on to the outside of the muzzle of the weapon. What you think is a front sight is in fact a bayonet lug. With the bayonet, there was no longer a need for the pike. The bayonet could stop the horses of the cavalry. Now every man could be issued a musket and every man could fire. The changes wrought by the emphasis on gunfire were immense. The line formation was instituted. Though the line formation does allow every man to fire his weapon, it is unwieldy. This created a need for drill. The musket's volume of fire depended upon its manipulation by the soldier. This created still more need for drill. The weapon had to be fired from a standing position, and most of the soldier's time was spent loading the musket. In battle, many of those about him were killed or wounded. The only way to keep the soldier efficiently at his task of loading and firing the musket was to emphasize discipline and drill above all other soldierly qualities. The smoothbore musket and line formation evolved into what we call linear warfare. A flintlock smoothbore musket with bayonet incorporated into linear warfare ruled the battlefield from roughly 1700 to 1850. Other weapons, such as the Kentucky rifle, did exist during this period. The rifle was far more accurate than the smoothbore. In a rifle, spiral grooves are cut in the bore. What appears as high spots in the barrel are the lands. The low areas are the grooves, and the distance from the bottom of the groove on one side to the bottom of the groove on the other side is groove diameter. The rifle gains its accuracy because the projectile spins in flight. In order to gain this spin, the bullet has to be groove diameter so that the lands can engrave corresponding notches on the side of the bullet and thereby induce this spin as the bullet travels down the barrel. But with a muzzle loader, how do you load the bullet from muzzle down to breech? In the Kentucky rifle, the ball was wrapped in a lubricated cloth patch. This patch had the notches engraved on it at the muzzle when it was loaded. The patched ball was not easy to ram, and the rifle required a good deal of extra equipment for loading. In the field, the rifleman had to carry all his extra gear slung about his neck on thongs or in pouches. We will analyze categorize all weapons using a methodology revolving around the word firepower. Firepower consists of three separate and distinct components: volume of fire, combat range, and terminal effect. The history of small arms technology is the history of developments and advances in the components, the design trade-offs involved, how these trade-offs were incorporated into tactical doctrine, and how they affected the outcome of battle. Volume of fire is the number of rounds that a well-trained operator can efficiently and accurately fire in 1 minute. This includes sustaining the fire over time. In a manually operated weapon, the soldier is the determining factor in volume of fire. Combat range is expressed as a distance within which human being-sized targets can be reliably hit. Many factors have an effect on combat range. One is accuracy, or shot-to-shot uniformity, so that all rounds hit in the same place. In the case of the flintlock smoothbore musket, lack of accuracy is the practical limit on combat range. The third component of firepower is terminal effect, the destruction of a target given a hit on that target. When terminal effect is a limiting factor, I will point that out. I urge you to keep the components of firepower constantly in mind. Every weapon cartridge combination has a unique blend of the three components. This blend gives it advantages and disadvantages in relation to other weapons. In no small measure, the tactical outcome of battle has been decided by the advantages and disadvantages of one nation's weapons against another, the leader's understanding of what those were, and how he made them work for him. Let's go to the chart. The combat range of the Kentucky rifle is increased in exchange for a corresponding decrease in volume of fire. However, there are still problems. Adjustable sights had not then been invented. At longer ranges, the shooter had to aim off the target, the so-called Kentucky windage. Further, most Kentucky rifles had roughly the bullet weight and energy of a 9mm pistol of today. They were inadequate in terminal effect beyond 180 yards. The Kentucky rifle was effective and made a contribution only when the leader understood the weapon's strengths and weaknesses and wove this into his organization and battle plan. An example of this is the Battle of Cowpens, where Daniel Morgan arranged his defending troops with the Kentucky riflemen in front. His instructions were to fire 2 rounds and then retreat along a predetermined path. The riflemen did considerable damage to Tarleton's forces, who, when they closed, found themselves confronted with mixed militia and the Continental Line. The backbone weapon during the American Revolution and all other wars of the era was the flintlock smoothbore musket. It was supplanted only when the use of rifling became practical. In the 1830s and 40s, a number of methods were tried in order to circumvent the problem of loading a rifled weapon from the muzzle. The best of these was the mini-ball. This bullet was made of soft lead and was slightly less than bore diameter for ease in loading. Its base was hollow. When the propellant gases pushed the bullet forward, they also expanded the side walls of the bullet into the barrel grooves, thereby engraving